Welcome today to our webinar on FDA's proposed food traceability rules, presented by Alan Sayler, who is the EAS Senior Director for Food Consulting Services. EAS Consulting Group is a member of the Certified family of companies. It is a global leader in regulatory solutions for industries regulated by FDA, USDA, and other federal and state agencies. And with our over 150 independent consultants worldwide, EAS offers the detailed knowledge and experience your company requires to ensure accurate and timely assistance with FDA policies on food safety, traceability, labeling, as well as technical submissions such as GRAS, food additive petitions, food contact notifications, and more. And Alan Sayler, whoops, for some reason I thought we had a bio for you, sorry about that. Alan Sayler is our Senior Director of Food Consulting Services at EAS. He has expertise in food processing as well as GSFI third-party certification programs such as Safe Quality Foods. Alan has more than 35 years of experience as a regulatory expert, including representing the U.S. food processing industry at the Codex Committees on Food Additives, Food Labeling, Food Hygiene, and milk products. Alan has held prestigious positions as Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and International Standards at the International Dairy Foods Association, as well as Acting Chief for FDA's Milk Safety Branch and Assistant Dairy Commissioner for the North Dakota Department of Agriculture. He has worked on dairy standards and grading programs at the Dairy Division of USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service. And prior to joining EAS, he was a managing partner at the Center for Food Safety and Regulatory Solutions. I'll just also mention Alan is a recent winner of two prestigious awards. One is the Honorary Life Member Award for the International Association of Food Protection in recognition of his contributions to food safety. And additionally, more recently, he was awarded the Award of Excellence by the International Dairy Federation for his outstanding contribution to their program. So with that, I will say I'll turn the presentation over to Alan. If you have questions during the webinar, you're welcome to type them into the questions box. And then Alan, let me send remote control over to you. Give mouse and keyboards to Alan. Okay, I'll mute and then you should be ready to go.
Okay, thank you very much, Amy. And good morning to everyone. I appreciate your time. We were working out some details. As one does have this situation, Amy and I are involved in lots of electronic communication, as you all are in this era of COVID, where Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Google, and other things are providing our main conduit. And of course, this morning, the electronics are acting up, but I think we're going to be fine today, and they're working well. Let me introduce the subject by simply saying that this is the list we've been using for 5 years, maybe longer. If we were asked what are the FSMA Foundation rules, we use these. And some of them are not that applicable to us, and others are very applicable to us. All of them are in some mode of implementation or enforcement. Almost all of these are actually already in the enforcement mode. FDA has been taking a very long time, and that's good for those in the industry, to not roll these out so much, but to educate their staffs and educate us in the industry. And I want to thank FDA for that because what we're seeing is an FDA field inspection group that seems to be better trained and better prepared than sometimes it has in the past when new regulations have come out. And we know that partly because some of the things that we are seeing at EAS, and we work with domestic companies to help them evaluate and enhance their food safety programs. We also work with international companies, and we work with food importers and exporters. And what we're seeing is companies, particularly outside the U.S., that have been shipping various food products into the U.S. for a long time successfully. And their products have now been held up. And I'm not saying this is a large issue, but products that have been coming in for 20 years are not allowed. We get a call because FDA cites the importer for something, and they say they don't understand because they've not changed a thing, and we find out that there's a fundamental U.S. regulation that has been violated and has not been caught for a long time, but they are catching them now. So FSMA is, I think, having some positive effects in enhancing the food safety for consumers. With that being said, this is no longer the state of affairs because we have some things that are not on list, and one of them is going to be the traceability rule, and let's call it the traceability record-keeping rule because that's really what it amounts to. I do want to point out, and we're not going to talk about it during this webinar, there's also, as of about a year ago, another proposed rule on laboratory accreditation, and we are looking to put some background information on that. What is interesting is, in the scheme of things, while we have no special feedback from FDA or others inside the agency, I would think that the finalization of this traceability record-keeping rule will probably take a higher priority than the laboratory accreditation. Now, all that can change in a heartbeat if there is, for instance, a significant problem that is identified as laboratory-based, where food laboratories have an issue that FDA has identified, then all of a sudden the laboratory accreditation program could fast forward and accelerate to a final rule. The traceability regulation, however, is what we're talking about today, so we'll go ahead and dive a little deeper into that. And I do want to set the stage a little bit by saying that there is something else on that prior slide that's missing, and that is the new era of smarter food safety. Now, we have, those of us that have been around as long as I have seen initiatives by FDA to publish rules, and sometimes they have never, ever seen the light of day, or they've taken a decade or more, and I've got examples. So if one thinks that this traceability rule, which is proposed, may never become final, I don't think that likelihood is very high at all. I certainly would not in any way put money on it. And that's because of this new era of smarter food safety. Now, Frank Yanis, who is the Deputy Commissioner of HHS, so you could say maybe even one step above the FDA Commissioner, has really been a fireball in promoting new ideas in the agency. And the smarter era is a new initiative to work smarter. Many of us work very hard, but a few of us, maybe like myself, could work smarter. And so they are saying, let us figure out ways for FDA to do a better job of identifying potential problems. They're very good at taking action after a problem has been identified, but they're still trying to do a better job. And so this is what the traceability is part of that. And so do not think this is going to go away. So with that, it was published in September. There are open comments until January 21st. Do not be surprised, although we've not heard that the open comment deadline of January 21st might be extended for lots of reasons. Can we bank on that? No. If you want to comment and you're not prepared because of the holidays, certainly you can ask for an extension in writing. I suspect some of the trade associations representing you will be doing so because it is an important new step. We actually thought we would have this a long time ago, and there was an initial attempt by FDA commissioning a study, and the study gave, I think, 15 or 18 recommendations on improving traceability, and it sat there for years. But as part of this input process, I do want to point out, I don't have a slide of it, that there will be 3 public meetings that FDA has announced where you can give your own opinions. I don't know if the speaker slots are open. The agenda has been set up, but those meetings are being held, and they're virtual, as we would guess, November 6th, which is past. Then we have November 18th, which is coming up very quickly, and then December 2nd. I'm sorry, 18th is past. Life in the world of COVID has some interesting challenges. But anyway, 2 of the public meetings have occurred. One is pending, and that is tomorrow. So if you have an interest, or if it has passed you by, like it seems to have passed me by, you can always get transcripts and read where the thoughts are. FDA in these public meetings is highly unlikely to give a lot of details, much more listening mode. Okay, so with that, let's look into what is this concept for this proposed rule on traceability. The first is 1 step up and 1 step back. Wait a minute. That's what we've been doing for a long time. So what is so new about that? Well, it appears that this concept could push beyond one step up and one step back. Now, what does that mean? The rule is not that specific. So what they're trying to do is for certain types of foods and certain type of food sectors to demand, I guess that's a good term for a regulatory agency, demand that all the connections from the farm to the fork are linked. There are no broken connections. And the broken connections don't exist in the industry because obviously things move from farm to fork, but they exist in the ability to trace back from fork to farm. And there are many nodes sometimes, and it could be one node that's broken, could be many nodes that are broken, and this is what it's intended to address. So this is a part of this whole concept of smarter era of food safety. So this will not be going away. Now, what are some terms? We're not trying to make you experts here, but I do want to tell you acronyms are a way of life. And just when we think we've learned the next set of acronyms, whether they come from a private sector or a government sector, then we get new ones. Well, these are not totally new because these have been used in other areas in the past. In fact, in the GSFI schemes of SQF, BRC, FSSC 22000, and IFS, you've probably seen these terms before, and certainly in other venues. The critical tracking events. So this traceability proposed rule is going to identify, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, critical tracking events. These are the events where FDA expects records to be available. So we have to identify what the critical tracking events are, and then what are these records? What is the information to be contained in these records? Well, that is what the key data elements, or KDEs, are. So KDEs are key data elements. FDA, at these critical tracking events, will expect records that will identify information about the KDEs. Now, which foods are we talking about? What food sectors are we talking about? Well, another acronym, food traceability lists. And these are foods where additional traceability records must be maintained. So the important thing about this list, and we'll be getting to it in a slide or two, is that we have seen some people represent this as the high-risk food list. This is not intended to be the case. FDA has made that very clear. So why would a food be on the list? And the food is on the list because based on some assessments, illness outbreaks, recalls, lots of data, big data crunching by FDA, they found these foods likely to have a higher possibility of creating foodborne illness or driving foodborne illness, or they have found significant traceability. Remember, FDA has sometimes gotten very frustrated in trying to figure out where a food problem came from. They know in general they'd like to go back to the facility, they'd like to go back to the farm if possible, and this is proven in some foods to be very difficult or impossible. So the rule has a number of sections. One on the description of the record, what are the KDEs, in other words, is the information in things like bills of lading, purchase orders, production logs, that will enhance the ability to trace. Even within a facility, it can be very difficult. The nodes connecting farm to fork or fork to farm can actually be broken, not during a transport on a vehicle or truck or train or ship. They can actually be broken inside a processing plant. And so that is why that there may very well be critical tracking events inside a processing plant, and I'll show you why that is true. There are terms for that. Also, they will focus on the records that have to be maintained if the food is on the list, the FTL. If codes, there's lots of technology about how to trace. You can put things into foods. You can mark containers of foods. You can just use paper for shipping and transport and processing of various foods, food ingredients, food additives. So there's an expectation if we use codes or some other technology, FDA and the FDA field investigators need to understand how that works so they can continue to make the links. Unique lot codes. So far, it appears that FDA will allow the industry to identify what is a lot. We'll see if that stays when the rule is finalized. So we can define a lot, and it is to our best interest to define a lot in a way that is not huge. In other words, I know when I've started doing inspections a number of years ago, a lot could be a month's production. The problem is, if I had a problem, then in some cases the whole lot had to be recalled, when in fact we knew it was just one day, but all our records are based on a lot, and the lot was a month. So I think that is unlikely today. We don't approach things that way, but I do want to caution you that identifying the lot size is more than just for convenience of production. It is also with the intent that if there is a potential problem, that we can narrow the scope of the problem quickly. And then there's other things as needed, so to speak. So let's look at this critical tracking events. And we've got some diagrams here or some pictorial representations that I think are much better than me trying to verbalize things. What FDA is looking at is the movement from, and there are critical tracking events when we grow and move the food, when we receive the food, when we transform the food, and I don't know what transform IN is, but I think transforming was the intent. And transforming many times does not happen on the farm. It may very well happen in an intermediate step between the farm and the processor, or it may actually happen at the processor. So then we can transform at the processor, possibly. We can also create. So what's the difference between transforming and creating? So I wouldn't over detail this presentation. I didn't put the definitions up there. They are available. But the creating is when you, in a processing plant, have steps that will produce the final food that is then sent out, whatever you are shipping out, whether it is an ingredient that somebody else will use or a consumer-ready or RTE food. So that's the creating, whereas transforming could be the front end. So you could have transforming and creating both occurring at the same facility. But FDA is going to view that as two steps, and you have traceability linking the two, and must be in place. And then finally shipping, and that isn't hard to understand. So when you look at those critical tracking events, what are the KDEs? Well, the little circular, I will say cylindrical, or maybe you can say rounded rectangles at the bottom below each of the KDEs identifies, or the CTEs identifies what the KDEs are. And my apologies for mixing those two up. So you may, at the grower, have a KDE for growing and a KDE for shipping. So that puts burden on the grower or the farmer. You can, as you move, and I'm going to move to the on-farm packer. This is a representation for vegetables, and so it may not be applicable to some of you that are listening today, but it may be for others. And then you can move over to the produce processor, where there's lots of KDEs. You are the first receiver. You are then receiving, transforming, and in this case, they don't have creating, because all we're probably doing is selecting, washing, and then packing, and then shipping out. You can then, at the distributor, have KDEs. And FSMA was interesting because it impacted food warehouses in a limited fashion, with a few exceptions, those being those that are refrigerated or where the product was exposed to the warehouse environment. Sometimes we're talking about fresh fruits and vegetables. The distributor now is going to be impacted if they have foods that they're handling on the list. And then we've got receiving and shipping, and then finally the retailer. So all of a sudden, the entire food chain is tied together by this regulation. Now, if we're looking at another example, and this is an example for growing and receiving KTEs for romaine lettuce, and it has, I didn't put the KDEs, but I did put the CTEs, and this gives you a sense of the nodes in the supply chain where FDA is identifying CTEs, and then the KDEs I didn't put down on this particular diagram. But you can go to the first receiver fact sheet, and you can download that from FDA. Another example, another CTE example would be for soft cheese. Some of you, if you are in the industry, dairy industry, this is applicable because soft cheese is on the list. And the importance is that the first CTE may come from milk being transported from the farm. It also may come from a manufacturer that is making a curd that then will be shipped to another manufacturer to make a soft cheese. And soft cheeses could be processed cheeses. And again, I won't go into the details of cheese manufacturing in the dairy industry, but you can see that in the case where we have the manufacturer on the bottom left, that could be very much a transformation. And then the second manufacturer, as we move slightly right, that is creation, because we're creating the end product. The first manufacturer to the left was transforming it, creating an initial ingredient type of a cheese, and then the next one is creating it. So just again, we also have more processed. Now this is a jar of salsa, but it may represent canned products. It may represent other types of products that could very well be ready to eat. And you can see that we may very well have, as far as CTEs in the realm of creation and transformation, the farm may be that as far as creation. The farm may do transformations as well as creation. The manufacturer may do transformation. And then we have a transformation at another processor, and I would say that that red rectangle where the jars of salsa processor circle is, and then you go down and see where the kill step is applied, that's transformation. It is probably also creation. So I would say that just because we only see transformation listed here, it was intended to try and demonstrate that, but I don't think that the example is complete, and I want to point that out. This is, again, information provided by FDA. Now, shipping. This is the final CTE step. And what are shipping records? What is expected? What kind of information? Well, this is an example. This is not that you have to have every one of these bullet items, but you have to have traceability lot codes. You have to have entry numbers, quantity, unit of measure. I won't read the whole list. And by the way, this presentation will be available on the EAS website in the near future, so you can certainly download it and look at some of the details I may have gone over a little too quickly. Shipping dates, shipping identifiers, reference records, and what are the records that are supposed to hold the required KDEs. Now, who holds those? Well, in this particular case, we're at the shipping CTE. It would be the shipper that holds them. But the transporter doesn't have to, believe it or not, the nodes and this regulation, as it's written now anyway, as we have a transporter that moves from farm to some type of an intermediate manufacturer to a final manufacturer to a distributor to a shipper, final shipper, and that's more of a complex system than probably most of us have. But if that's the case, the transporter that moves through each one of those nodes is not required to keep the records. But guess what? Each one of those main nodes, which is a CTE, is required. And that means that in many cases, the transporter is critical to transferring the information, because in some cases, the transporter is the only one that knows and has the records that you will find the KDE information on. I hope that makes sense. So here is the infamous list. Again, I do want to point out that this is not a high-risk food list. FDA's tried to make that clear. However, it does seem that people are thinking about it in that fashion. So if you look, most of the entries are in two categories. It is fresh fruits and vegetables, and it is seafood, or crustaceans, or mollusks, which in my opinion are all seafood. You do see cheese. Now, these are not in order of priority, so do not think that, for instance, shell eggs is the second highest concern to FDA. This is not a prioritized list, and I would not be surprised if this list gets changed a little bit as FDA gets these comments, looks at them, and then finalizes the rule. But for now, these are the foods where if you are producing this type of a food, then the entire regulation applies to you. However, we do have some exceptions. So, again, so one of the questions that did come in was, could I be a little more clear in the records and who has to maintain the records? So what the regulation does exempt, and we'll cover it in the slide here again, but it's never hurts to repeat it, is if I'm a transporter, I own a trucking company, or I'm a freight train company, or I'm a ship company that moves foods, and these foods are on this list, this FTL list, then I am not required to maintain the traceability records that the proposed regulation requires. However, the organization that I picked the food up from and the organization I'm delivering it to, they are required. So then the question is, okay, well, you just put shipping up there. So what does that mean? So shipping may be a secondary warehouse. Maybe it's a bad choice of terms, but I use the terms that FDA had so that I would not confuse things. And sometimes the terms that FDA selects are not intended, but they can be confusing. So that last point about shipping means a facility. So the facility, distribution may be a warehouse, a shipper may be a secondary warehouse. Those entities have to keep, if they handle these foods anyway, have to keep records with the KDEs. Now, I hope that clarifies, and we've got another slide, so let's move on, and maybe we can reinforce that when that comes up. Now, as far as the records themselves, so those foods that trigger the requirement for critical data elements and then the records with that contain the KDEs, they must be maintained. They can be electronic, but they must be maintained for 2 years. They must be made available to FDA within 24 hours after requesting. And again, we're in a proposed rule, but this is so consistent with the rest of the FSMA regulations, it's unlikely this will change. Now, this is something that I wonder will survive to the end rule. This third bullet, electronic sortable spreadsheet containing relevant traceability information must be provided to FDA within 24 hours of request when necessary to assist FDA during an outbreak, recall, or other threat. So if you are involved as the industry in an outbreak, or you are suspected of providing a food or food ingredient that may be the cause of the outbreak, and you're up to your ears in recall alligators, you will also have to have resources to provide FDA with the traceability information. Okay? So this spreadsheet is very, very detailed. It isn't always common for FDA and the regulations to provide this kind of granularity, but it's here. And I frankly think that it wouldn't have made it here if there wasn't widespread support within FDA. So be prepared if you see it in the final rule. And then simply electronic records, if you use them, must comply with 21 CFR Part 11. And I think that's for another webinar maybe. Now, first receiver records. We did have in the CTEs, after the farm, there's a first receiver many times. If it doesn't go directly to a food processing plant, where then you'd be transforming or you'd be creating. So what do we need for first receiver records? The location identifier, obviously where it is, contact people, their contact information, description of where the food is cooled and the date of the cooling, and this is applicable for refrigerated foods, and then the date and time of packing. And this, as you can tell, is very applicable in the fresh fruit and vegetable industry, not so much in most others. Okay. Now, exemptions. Who, regardless of whether you're handling a food that is on the FTE list or not, who does not have to maintain these traceability records? Farms. Because when the farm is not subjected to the produce rule, because it only sells a gross average of $25,000 a year in produce sales or less. Now, please understand, I didn't say farms full stop. I said farms that are not subjected to the produce safety rule. So if you are a farm that is subjected to the produce safety rule, then you're subject to maintaining traceability records if this gets finalized. Shell egg producers with fewer than 30,000. Why? Because that exemption exists throughout FSMA. As to justifying it, I think somebody will have to go to FDA. I'm not sure why the 30,000 was picked, but I'm sure or 3,000 was picked. I'm sure there's a good reason for it. Originators whose value of the food sold averages less than $25,000 on a 3-year average, and that's the last 3 years. So that is similar to a very small business definition, except it's actually much smaller. So believe it or not, some of the exemptions in the FSMA regulations, particularly on the produce safety, not so much there, but also on the preventive controls for human foods, that has changed. So somebody that might qualify for exemptions under the preventive controls for human foods may not qualify for exemptions under the traceability rule unless this is changed. There is an odd inconsistency there. If packaging of food remains in place until the food reaches consumers and it prevents subsequent contamination or alteration of the food. Now that one is a little uncertain because most food doesn't start with a package. Now, if a package is an outside skin, if I'm talking about an orange, for instance, is that what they mean? I don't think so. I think it's actually a man-applied or a woman-applied, human-applied package. So what this means as far as, when does this exemption apply would be interesting. I do want to apologize, but I do want to go back because there was a question on what do we mean by kill step. A kill step is probably a crude term these days, but in almost all FDA regulations and their view of what is a kill step, it's a 5-log reduction of the most pertinent pathogens. So if that is required, now there are some cases like fresh fruits and vegetables. What is the kill step? How do we prove to FDA that we have reduced the pathogen load by 5 logs? And the answer is the produce regulation has many steps that if you comply, the intent is that it has the same effect. But there is no kill step because if we, for instance, heated or now irradiation might work, but it may not. There is no real kill step in the fresh fruit and vegetable industry in most cases. Now, in the nut industry, yes, and in other industries there is. So I hope that helps. Finally, let's take the last bullet here, which is the labeling of food. If the labeling of the food reaches consumers, includes the name, complete address, and business phone number of the farm where the food was produced, then, because the traceability linkages are complete, there is no need for anyone to keep any regulations. So that was good. Now, other things, produce that receives commercial processing that adequately reduces the presence of microorganisms of public health significance as per the produce safety rule, then don't have to comply with the traceability. Now, I find this very interesting because we know that produce seems to have a much higher rate of foodborne illness and recalls. Probably the only thing that would exceed that is a category where allergens, which aren't a food category, certainly drive the highest rate of recall. So shell eggs are exempt when they are produced at a particular farm and receive a treatment. Now, the egg safety rule, which has been around for a while, but there is a new regulation applicable to that requiring farms to build HACCP plans, laying operations where the eggs come from, to have HACCP plans. So that's something worth mentioning. Or if a kill step of any FTL food, and again, that was we covered that, so I hope that is clear. So this is processing exemptions, okay? Okay, then there are partial exemptions, and I think we'll just hit these at a very high level. Again, there are certain small retail food establishments where they do not have to keep if there are FTEs fewer than 10 or if they're, and they may have a full exemption or a partial exemption requiring the electronic spreadsheet. So a partial exemption is you don't have to do the spreadsheet. You still have to have records that have the KDEs identified. Retail food establishments that purchase directly from farms, because we know, again, the linkage is existing and we don't need to have extra records because we know where on the farm, if there was a problem, which farm it came from. Farm to school and farm to institutional programs. Now, this is institutional. Think of this as government almost entirely. So if a school district decides to buy directly from a farm, or a government entity decides to buy directly from a farm, the same issue as before, is that the linkage for traceability is established. And if for fishing vessels, first of all, the fishing vessel, in most cases, not all, but in most cases, has to be registered as a food facility, and so it's registered with FDA. Then they if they have to register, then they have to do one back and one forward. If they don't have to register, then they are exempt, at least partially exempt. Okay. Other exemptions are here: non-profitable food establishments, just because of the burden. We don't have to keep a list of where we got things on our refrigerator in our kitchen at home because personal consumption is exempted. And if you hold food for an individual consumer, now this says persons. It'd be interesting to understand better what persons is defined at, because we have an explosion of mini fulfillment centers around the country. Many times large food warehouses or large grocery stores, to reduce traffic, and particularly during COVID, you can order the food and you don't go to that particular store or warehouse. You go to the mini fulfillment center and you let them know you're coming, and they give you the basket, bag, or whatever, and off you go. And so is persons indeed an individual, a private individual, or is this an entity that holds food for individual consumers? We'll have to understand that better. And special requirements, again, for food subject to a kill step. And the kill step keeps coming back, so I hope I defined that so that'd be easy enough to understand what that is. Waivers. Now, waivers are interesting. They are not exemptions. These are where an entity or one of the nodes, one of the CTEs, is required to have records of traceability, and in fact, for a number of reasons that only FDA would review and then could accept, they're waived. Economic hardship could be. Let's say that we have some type of a crisis where food can't move, for instance, the wildfires of California, and we weren't getting shipments of fresh fruits and vegetables from Mexico or anywhere else, and all of a sudden, we had problems, and entities couldn't ship because of many things, but also because of lack of traceability records, or they were just too burdensome. So you could get a waiver. I don't think waivers will be permanent. I highly doubt that, but they must not be contrary to public interest. So that is an interesting side note. The traceability for fresh-cut romaine lettuce. And here we do see the KDEs, and this is a very good demonstration. The circles, or the oblong circles, are the critical tracking elements, CTEs. For each CTE, what do I have to have for a KDE? I need the KDEs on the left side for the grower and for the shipping from the grower. And then I can go all the way to the distributor, and I have to have receiving KDEs and shipping KDEs, because I'm shipping out. And then the retailer, except for those exemptions we just talked about, must have receiving KDEs. And then you can go in the processor. I find this very interesting because you have a first receiver KDE, this is theoretical. You have a receiving KDE. You have a transformation KDE. Now, the reason there's no creation here, the romaine lettuce is not somehow magically turned into cabbage or something else. It stays romaine lettuce. So therefore, there is no creation KDE in this particular example. It's just a transformation KDE. Okay, so enforcement. Again, a speculation on my part. I have no special knowledge, but I do think that FDA will be pushing as part of this initiative on the new era of smarter food safety to move this along. So I would not be surprised to see by summer or the fall of 2021 that this proposed rule is finalized. And then if it's finalized, it becomes effective 60 days after publication. Now, there's something important to understand, is compliance would be 2 years after the effective date. So when it is published in the Federal Register, right now, FDA is proposing they would not enforce it until 2 years after the publication date. So if, let's just pick October 1st as a theoretical date of 2021, when it is published in the Federal Register, we've got until 2023, October 1st, to get all of our traceability ducks in order. Okay, and enforcement, it's pretty much the same as almost everything. We have two approaches. We have one approach, two types of categories. One is domestic production, one is imports. And they will be treated as far as the enforcement tools that FDA has pretty much in the same way. So I hope I have covered that in enough detail to make it informative and to spur you to also look at some of the information that FDA has provided. It's a proposed rule. Take a look at the transcripts from these public hearings. FDA, you're not going to find FDA giving a lot of new information. What you will find is industry views, and you can determine whether they align with yours. With that, Amy, I do see we have some questions. If you'd like, I could start going through them.
Sure. I've got the questions pulled up here. We do have a couple questions on cottage cheese and whether it is considered a soft cheese.
I can assure you cottage cheese is a soft cheese, yes.
Okay. If we deal in dried fruits, tropical fruits number 13, do we also need to maintain the FTL?
The question is, I'm going to rephrase it if you're okay with that, Amy. The question, I think, is fruits, many types of fruits are on the FTL, the magic list, if you will. What about dried fruits? Does it, in fact, say anything about dried? And right now, it doesn't say that. And my sense is that even though we know the FTL is not a risk list, it is more oriented toward fresh. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say, I think dried fruits are not going to be part of the FTL, and therefore, if they're not, and they're not added by the time of the final rule, then the traceability would not apply to them.
Okay, and then someone else has a further clarification. They're curious about mango puree. Would that be the same?
What kind of puree? I'm sorry?
Mango?
Oh, mango, yes. It does seem to be the case. Now, the question is there a kill step in a mango puree? And if a mango puree is refrigerated, it probably has undergone a kill step. If it has not refrigerated and is shelf stable, it has definitely undergone a kill step. Otherwise, it would not be allowed for other LACF or acidified food regulations. So my sense is, without knowing more about the product, that it would not be included in the traceability record-keeping requirements.
Okay, thank you. We have a question regarding foreign suppliers. Does FDA require that foreign suppliers follow the rule?
There is no exemption for foreign suppliers, and as you know, we get a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables from outside the U.S., and they're provided by foreign suppliers. So if my theoretical date of October 1st, 2021 is when the final rule is published in the Federal Register, by October 1st of 2023, all of these foreign suppliers that provide foods on the FTL or the FT list will have to comply. And the question is, well, I'm one of these foreign suppliers. I really don't want to comply. I'm from Mexico. I live under Mexican regulations, or I'm in Germany. that's fine. But if Alan doesn't want to comply, Alan doesn't get his food into the U.S. anymore.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question on traceability, and that is, down the road, do you envision that FDA could add more types of products to this requirement?
I think the answer is very likely. I think the list as we see it now in the proposed rule is not going to be the list in the final rule. I would be surprised if it decreases, and I would not be surprised if it increases.
Okay. And in reference to shipping, would you explain what types of shipping are exempt?
Okay. And again, I apologize for not being clear in the presentation. So let's use the term shipper, and let's use the term transporter. It is clear, even though the slide didn't show it, that transporters that move the product from one of the CTEs to another CTE are not required to have the traceability records. They can, but they're not required to. So transporters, even though they're in the exempt list, are not required to have any traceability records. Shippers versus shipping, let's use the term shippers. Shippers are a physical location. Could be a warehouse, could be the back end of your manufacturing facility where there's a warehouse and a loading dock. It could be a secondary warehouse. It could be a large retail organizations, usually have central warehouses, and they ship them from the central warehouse to the retailer, or sometimes they ship them from the central warehouse to a small staging area in each city, and then they're moved from the staging area to the retail grocery store. That staging area would be a shipper, and they would be required to have the traceability records with the KDE information.
Okay, thank you. Another viewer asked, will squid be included on the FTL?
Interesting. So squid is a seafood, and yet if you look at the FTL, and I copied it, I think almost verbatim from the regulation, you don't find squid in there. So what are we to do? Well, it says, is squid a mollusk? No. Is it a crustacean? No. Is it a finfish? No. However, while that is what the list says today, there will be modifications, I have no doubt, either in the final rule or after the final rule. So my suggestion is, while squid is not specifically listed, doesn't seem to fall into those categories, I'm going to presume that it probably will. But as of today, no.
Okay, thank you. Is FDA going to release a list of certified laboratories that are abroad anytime soon?
We're switching gears from traceability to laboratory accreditation, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the question. I apologize if that isn't the question. But please understand the laboratory accreditation program that was published in a proposed rule in November of 2019 has not been finalized. And FDA right now does not have the authority, unless they go to court, to demand laboratory records from laboratories for private samples. Now, they have in the past sometimes gone to court in very serious outbreaks. So at this point in time, the answer is there is no FDA-approved list. There is one exception, and that is very germane only to the grade A dairy industry. FDA is involved in a certification program for private laboratories that provide regulatory results for grade A dairies and dairy products. But for most of us, that doesn't apply. So, no, there is no list right now.
Okay, thank you. Also, I'll just mention Alan is working on putting together a webinar for early 2021 on the laboratory accreditation. So stay tuned for that if that is of interest to you. Another question on this particular proposed rule. Do you have any anticipated timeline for when a final rule will be published?
I'm probably as unqualified as anyone to give that, but I do believe, I know Frank Yanis, I know that this new era of smarter food safety is really appealing inside the agency. As long as we continue to have food recalls and food illness outbreaks, even though it seems like it's diminished a bit during COVID for whatever reason, it's not going to go away, and this initiative is not going to go away. And so if all of that is the proper premise to make a prediction, then I would say by probably the earliest, the July, August timeframe for the final rule. I think it's more likely at the earliest in the October, November timeframe. I would be very surprised if this isn't a final rule by 2022.
Okay, great. I don't see any other questions, so if you have any final questions or concerns, if you'll just type them into the questions or the chat box. And I don't see anything coming through, and we are just about at an hour. So thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you, Alan, for another great presentation. Again, we apologize for the delay in starting, but do appreciate your sticking with us. And we look forward to seeing you at a future EAS webinar or seminar short course soon. Thanks so much, everyone, and enjoy your day.
Have a good day. Thank you, Amy. Take care.
Thank you.